Welcome, everyone. I think we can get started. So, I'm Phil Capin. I'm assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and welcome to episode 6 in our Usable Knowledge Live Literacy Insights series. Across this series, our goal has been to connect evidence from reading science to the day-to-day practices that teachers and educators are facing across our country and across the world. We've covered many topics in our 5 previous episodes. We've talked about what is the science of reading? How do we support students with dyslexia? What about multilingual learners? How can we support readers in this digital age? And just last week, we met with Meredith Rowe to learn about home literacy practices. Today, we're turning to a topic that I'm really excited about, reading comprehension. What does the science say about reading comprehension, and how can we best support students? There's been a lot of attention in our country about how to support students with developing foundational literacy skills. And although there's a lot of agreement about the importance of reading comprehension, I think that we haven't had the same sustained focus on it. So we're really excited to have the conversation today. And that conversation will be with Dr. James Kim. Uh, Dr. Jimmy Kim is the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He has expertise across literacy, experimental design, and quantitative methods. And he brings that expertise to carry out a program of research focused on developing and evaluating literacy interventions at scale. He does this in partnership with school teachers and with his colleagues at the Reads Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thanks, Jimmy, for being here, and thanks for all the work you've done with More.
It's great to be here, Phil.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about More in a few minutes. That's Jimmy's content literacy program that's been shown to be really impactful for improving students' vocabulary and comprehension performance. So, Jimmy, as we get started here, I want to think about, what is comprehension? As I said at the outset, a lot of attention on foundational reading. And I think that there's more for us to understand and to gain clarity about, what is comprehension? Why does it break down for some students? What does it really take to support students to develop reading comprehension? So maybe we could start with that. How do you define comprehension, and what are some key understandings that you think every educator would benefit from knowing?
So I love that question, Phil, and I just want to welcome everyone to today's presentation. And I also want to say personally that although I'm a professor like Phil at Harvard, I most strongly self-identify as a classroom teacher because I started my career as a middle school history teacher. And I know, Phil, you are also a teacher. So that's a great question to start with because what I like to say when I talk about reading comprehension is that you never just read. You always read something. And that idea is really critical because when you see the two words reading comprehension, you think, oh, it's just this one thing. And we have to remember reading comprehension is not one thing. It's not a single entity. And I'm going to make this a little concrete for everyone. So imagine you're reading an article and it says the following. They're very sound in what they do. Defensively, they are a good tackling team. They have great corners. Obviously, the pass rush is good. Now, I must be talking about UT Austin because they have a great football team, and that's where Phil came from. But what's important about that passage and comprehending that passage is that there's actually two tasks that are going on. And the person who made this point very clear is Walter Kinch. He is a very famous psychologist, and he had a model of how reading comprehension occurs. And in 1993, he wrote this famous article called Text Comprehension, Memory, and Learning. And he basically said, you never just read because one, there's the memory task. And that is just literally reading the words, remembering exactly what those words are, what they said. And that's pretty straightforward. It's important. Kids sometimes struggle with it, but it's pretty straightforward. The second thing you have to do is you have to learn. You have to get a gist of what's going on in that passage and connect it to your background knowledge and make inferences. Because writers obviously don't tell you everything you need to know. They make a lot of assumptions. And if I were to ask you, what sport is this? Most of you are going to know the answer to that. Like if I ask Phil the question, Phil, you're going to say, Jimmy, this is like so easy. This is football. But the word football is not mentioned anywhere in that sentence I read. The author is just assuming that you know it's football, and they're assuming that you know what a what it means to tackle. They're assuming that you know that a cornerback is the guy who covers the wide receiver. All kinds of assumptions are made. And so the very important idea here is that you can read the words and remember what's said and get a gist. But if you don't have some background knowledge, you're not going to be able to make an inference and answer that question. What sport is this? So whenever I hear that phrase, Phil, the science of reading or the science of reading comprehension, I always say, complete the sentence. Reading is a transitive verb. It has an object. Like you read about football or you read simple stories. You don't just read. And I think that's one of the most important understandings that you can have, that we always read something and we're reading either the words, kind of remember what's going on, or we're learning something new, which requires background knowledge and inferencing.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important point. And it couldn't be underscored enough, is that reading is not a single ability, it's a domain-specific ability that's influenced by, general cognitive, factors and but your ability to understand what you read in one context, like football, I have a lot of background knowledge about, but if you
Yeah.
put me in another context, I don't think I would have the same background knowledge and my ability to make inferences would really vary. I think the other thing that I might add is
Hmm.
that it depends on your background knowledge and also some of your ability to your language processing.
Hmm.
Even students with similar background knowledge might vary a bit in how well they can parse the syntax, their ability to sort of untangle long sentences, their ability to navigate the discourse. If you're reading a
Hmm.
historical text, you might be reading something that's making an argument for one interpretation of history, which might be different than a science text that's focused on, explanation. And so I do think, background knowledge is really critical, and then also supporting some of those language-based processes and helping students to understand when comprehension's breaking down. So I'm sort of arguing maybe language processing as well as background knowledge. What are some of the other key understandings that you'd want teachers to know?
It's interesting. I would totally echo what you said, Phil, because I'm going to talk about this later. But since you brought it up, I'll just make a point of it here. I'm sure that everyone on this show knows the famous reading rope. It's the
Mm,
poster child of science reading on almost every, State Department of Instruction website. And this is based on Hollis Scarborough's very famous visual that shows two strands that are interwoven to produce skillful reading. One is language comprehension and one is word recognition. And I think you're absolutely right, Phil. I think we give too limited attention to the skills under language comprehension, one of which is the set of skills that you just talked about, language processing, verbal reasoning, vocabulary. They're all kind of bundled together. I think it's absolutely critical that those skills are also explicitly taught.
yeah. And I think your point about really matters in different contexts. I think that takes me back to, the reading rope, I think is really helpful in unpacking these broad dimensions. It tells you, what's involved in word recognition, what's
Hmm.
involved in language comprehension, as you point out. But this is going to vary based on the text and the purpose for reading. And so I
Yeah.
think your comment that this isn't just one thing, the skills will be drawn on to different degrees based on the text that you're reading.
Yeah, and I think the what you just said about we all have, there's no such thing as a garden variety poor reader. We use that phrase a lot in the research world, but we are, good readers of football, but poor readers of baseball because we know more about football than baseball. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind, that we have to pay attention as much to the skills that lead to productive and engaged reading as we do the kind of target of reading. Another thing that I'd say, Bill, that's been kind of misguided is folks probably are very familiar with the five pillars of scientifically based reading,
Mm,
and so you hear it all the time. I'm not against that. It came out of the National Reading Report. But as Hugh Katz and many others have said, we can't treat reading comprehension as one of five pillars. It's actually the end to which we're working toward. It's far more important than the other four pillars. But the problem with that conceptualization is again, it conveys the idea that there's this one thing called reading comprehension, and there isn't. There's comprehension of football, basketball, of narrative text, of informational text. We really have to focus on that when we think about reading comprehension.
Yeah. I think the point I would add there, I think that's a really important point is that unlike some of the other pillars in the National Reading Panel, like phonemic awareness, the ability to perceive sounds within words, phonics, matching letters on sounds, those are more discrete skills that you can teach directly. And I think, you're making the point that these pillars are not equal, which I agree with. And I would also say that putting them all as pillars suggests maybe that they could be taught similarly. And I
Yeah,
think that reading comprehension is a skill that you can't as directly teach. It's influenced by an array of different skills, your knowledge, your language processing,
yeah,
all of these. Your purpose, like how motivated you are to read the text influences it.
right.
So
It's
let's,
it's
oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I know you're going to ask me this next question, but I can't resist, Phil, because the other thing that we'll often say in the field is the purpose of reading is not comprehension. Like when you go to the beach and you start reading your book, you don't go down to the beach and go, "Oh, let's see if I'm comprehending this passage. I think I'm going to use a reading comprehension strategy to make." That's not why you read a book. You read a book because you're curious about the topic or you have some knowledge gap. We have to keep that in mind. Often the best way to improve reading comprehension is indirectly rather than directly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's where I was going to take us. I mean, I love talking about reading comprehension and what it is and what it isn't. But I think many of the people on the webinar with us and the people that watch us later are really interested in how can we best support reading comprehension in our classrooms and our homes. And so what kinds of instruction do you think is maybe most powerful in helping students to develop reading comprehension?
Yeah, Phil, this is a hugely important practical question. And so again, I want to make the instructional challenge really concrete with another reading passage. See, folks on this webinar didn't realize I was going to throw out all these pop quizzes. But here's the next one, and I'm going to try to stump you, Phil. All right.
Yeah.
So here's a passage. Rhodes put on 84, but with the ball turning, Mark Waugh could not hit with impunity, and his 8 overs cost only 37. Then Rhodes pulled rifle to Bevan at deep square leg. So my question to everyone is, what sport is this, and what is deep square leg?
Well, I have
And
no idea.
yeah, well, there
I
you
want to
go, Phil.
apologize if you've written
Okay.
about this because I didn't read your article.
There you go. And I was hoping that that's what you're going to say. And I bet a lot of my colleagues would say that, well, I bet everyone can do what Kinch called the memory task. You could probably decode the words and kind of remember, what the author is saying, but you are struggling with the learning task. You're struggling to answer the questions I just asked you because it doesn't tell you what the sport is and it doesn't tell you what deep square leg is. Well, I'll tell you what this passage is about. It is about the sport cricket, and deep square leg is a fielding position on the cricket field. So this leads me to some instructional ideas that we are trying to emphasize in our work, and I hope that schools around the country are emphasizing. The first is really obvious. You must build kids' background and vocabulary knowledge so they can read about these new and unfamiliar topics, whether it's cricket or cells or economic market systems. One of the most common mistakes, Phil, that I see when I go into schools or talk to teachers is teachers are trying to build a dictionary in kids' heads. And the reason that's true is because curriculum makers have these things called tier two words, these general purpose words that are useful across disciplines like analyze or incentive. Those are important words to learn, but we don't want to try to build a dictionary in kids' heads because that's not how you learn words. The way you learn words is you learn words as networks. You learn words as part of a conceptual networks because those words are related to each other. So we have this saying instructionally that we borrowed from a linguist way back in 1957, and it goes like this. You need to know words by the company they keep. And what that means is you need to know the form and meaning of the word's pronunciation and spelling, and you need to know the word based on its semantic context. So find a few really important words that hang out together when you're reading about football or the American Revolution and teach those words so that kids know them deeply, very, very deeply. The other thing that I would say, Phil, about the instructional question is something we were talking about earlier, which is if you go back to the What Works Clearinghouse, improving reading comprehension in K to 3, a lot has changed since then. One thing that practice guide does not mention are things like improving background knowledge. So what has changed? Well, one thing that's changed is there was a big project called Reading for Understanding, and two projects that were really effective instructionally were one that you know a lot about, Phil, called PAC, Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text, and Word Generation, which was led by my colleague Catherine Snow here at Harvard. And let me just emphasize a couple of instructional moves that are common across those programs, across other effective programs. One is you've got to motivate your kids with a mission. So I love how in Word Generation, one thing that Catherine and her team does, they give kids a really engaging question like, should schools give kids financial incentives to learn? Should we pay kids to learn? Now, don't you think kids would want to debate
Mm.
that? Of course. Well, it's that as they debate that, they're also using that important word incentive. Impact, you use something called a comprehension canopy and essential words and team-based learning. So kids are learning about the American Revolution and they're working together to figure out which colony they would settle in and why. And they use these historical words like revolution and independence, and they use team-based learning to acquire and apply knowledge. So there's a real emphasis on peer learning. So if you give kids a motivating mission, you teach words by the company they keep, and you build these strong peer connections, those are all precursors to kids engaging with text. And I would say those are very, very important instructional moves that we now know are effective that we didn't necessarily know 15 years ago.
Yeah. That's really important points. What's interesting is around the same time as the National Reading Panel came out in 2000, there was another report that came out called How People Learn.
Yeah.
And you know this, but maybe not everyone will know. In this report on learning sciences, they made, they identified several foundational principles with robust evidence across learning science. And so this isn't specific to reading, but it is inclusive of it. And the first recommendation that they put forth is that students should engage with meaningful problems that help establish a purpose for learning. And I
Mhm.
think that aligns very closely to the work that Catherine Snow did in WordGen and in subsequent iterations, and to what Sharon Vaughn and colleagues did related to PACT, the other program.
Yep.
And then the other principles that come out, and I can't recall them all by memory, but I do know that there's a real strong emphasis on building students' knowledge to sort of recognize what their current knowledge level is, and then to progressively deepen that knowledge and to provide opportunities for students to gain feedback. And so that really, I think, aligns with some of your recommendations. And, I always feel more confident when, the reading science is bolstered by the learning science.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hugely important point, Phil, about the connection between the science of learning and the science of reading, and the fact that we shouldn't ask, is this developmentally appropriate? We should ask, what is the knowledge kids need to learn this topic?
Yeah. So that's, I think, a really important point. I think that there's been some misunderstandings about this. I think myself as a former teacher didn't always recognize that the best way to get students to achieve a really challenging task is not to, give them less challenging text and slowly build them up. It's to, I think now, to build the scaffolds in place so they can engage with that really
Mhm.
complex text. And I know your work at Moore and other work you've done, you've sort of set the bar high. Students are engaging in complex tasks. You're thinking about scaffolding. So maybe you could provide some advice, maybe starting to think about more and telling the audience about more about the ways in which you help students to engage in complex texts.
I think the first thing is what you said, Phil, about scaffolding. So more is a spiral curriculum. That's a term that Jerome Bruner coined back in 1960. A spiral curriculum is just a curriculum where kids revisit topics in greater depth and complexity every year. And the reason why that's important for improving something like third grade reading, it's a spiral curriculum that starts in first grade, goes to second and third grade, is we wouldn't expect kids to master the meaning of important concepts like, living systems in 1 year. We know that they need to come back to it, just like we as adults do. So one thing we do and more is we have a spiral curriculum where it's leading up to the most complex topic in third grade of living systems, but we don't talk about that abstract idea. Instead, we teach kids about how could you help astronauts stay safe in the microgravity of space because your human body system gets weak. And when you motivate more missions, that gets kids very interested in doing science and learning the words to answer the question. The second thing we do is I like to think that we kind of took word generation impact and what we knew in the field and try to adapt it for really little kids. Those are programs for adolescent readers. Could we start this much earlier? So we teach science and social studies words as these vocabulary networks. And the way that I would explain it to the audience is words are like people. You need to spend time with people to get to know to get to know people well. Just like you need to spend a lot of time with words to get to know to get to know them well. Let me give you an example of a word we teach them more, system. That's a hard word. Well, we teach system in the context of the human body system and the structure and function of different parts of the human body system, but we also teach the word system in the context of social studies where kids are learning about market systems and how they have a structure, consumers and producers. So they have to really know this word deeply by the company that it keeps, and they have to know the other words that are connected to it semantically. Then the other thing that we do in more is we have a huge emphasis on teacher language and what you talked about earlier, Phil, the kind of verbal reasoning and the oral language. And we use something called analogical mapping. And that's just a fancy way of saying we have teachers use analogies to help kids think about what they're reading. So when they read a grade 3 passage that goes like this, the anatomy of a skyscraper is like the human body. It has bones that keep it tall and a brain that's like a command center. What is the analogy that kids are using? They're using the thing that they're familiar with, which is a human body system, to learn something new, which is a skyscraper. But those concepts are still relevant in both. So I think if we can motivate more missions, help kids know words deeply by the company they keep, and teach by analogy, it can help kids transfer these words and these ideas across a lot of topics. And that's what I think gets you better reading comprehension.
hmm this relates closely to learning science, right? I mean, teaching by analogies is something that's really a lot of research to support that outside of reading and now within. And the same is for the schemas, right? Building
Yeah.
these, semantic maps and frameworks for students to be able to attach new words to. So in the follow-up materials, we'll be sure to share information about more how people can engage with the materials. Um, I think there's probably, many teachers and educators that are participating in this who may not teach in grades 1 through 3. And so you talked to a couple about those design principles. I wonder if you could try to make it concrete for teachers. Like, what is one thing maybe next week? Well, I guess the school year is coming to an end. We still have one more week in Massachusetts. Like, what is one thing next week that you would encourage, whether a fifth grade or seventh grade teacher to focus on?
I would try to encourage teachers to help. The phrase that I use a lot is help kids travel widely. In other words, no matter what subject you're teaching, what we really care about in American education is this question of transfer. Can kids take what you're teaching them and apply it to some novel situation? So whatever you're teaching next week, try to use a metaphor or simile and ask your students, how is um, how do animals survive? Suppose you've been teaching your kids about animal survival,
Mm-hmm.
and say, okay, how do stores survive? Right? Very simple. But see if the kids can take the idea of survival in an ecosystem to the idea of survival in a market system. And see if by asking a lot more questions that are framed as metaphors and similes, you can get kids to transfer. And we know that this kind of decontextualized language, which is an idea that again, Catherine talked about, talking beyond the here and now, is a real precursor to improved literacy. Mainly because a lot of what we're doing in comprehension is we're resolving a lot of semantic ambiguities. We're doing a lot of thinking, right, to
Mm-hmm.
understand what's going on in a text. And I think Noni, our dean, has said this before many times. Struggling readers are not struggling thinkers. Get kids to think a lot before you engage in the text, and that underscores what you said, Phil, about don't change the text, but really provide the scaffolding so the kids can have on-ramps to the text.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat by Grace about how this connects to early childhood education. And I think what you said there about decontextualized language, so and the abstract vocabulary that you're talking about and more, a lot of that applies very closely to the preschool age when we want students to move beyond talking about what's on the floor right in front of them to what's happening before their school day or after their school day. And the vocabulary they have the most trouble with is that abstract vocabulary. So I think a lot of these principles travel down to preschool and they travel up.
Absolutely, Phil. The best example that I use from preschool is I know many of our colleagues on this call probably have read Click Clack Moo by Sandra Boynton. Well, you all know what that's about. The cows are like really cold and they want to get some blankets from Farmer Brown, and they have an ultimatum and they send it with duck. Think about that. The book is talking about governments and ultimatums, and this is a preschool book. What a great way to have discussions about, decontextualized language or topics beyond the here and now that really engage kids.
Yeah, wonderful. You got a yes with exclamation points from Grace in the chat. So I want to maybe pan back from our discussion of more to think about how we can move from pockets of success to, more successful systems to support reading comprehension. And so I wonder, for those that are maybe leaders in education, what do you think are the key levers at a systems level to improve? Um, Reading comprehension, recognizing, that we've been talking a lot about instruction, but even good teachers maybe aren't able to fulfill the needs of their students in individual classrooms when the systems aren't really in place.
Yeah, I love this systems question. I'm going to say two things, Phil. The first is that school systems aren't paying for one curriculum. So you think, oh, we have this curriculum and then we teach it. They actually pay for three curricula. One is called the intended curricula. The second is the enacted curriculum. And the third is the assessed curriculum. So the intended is like what is on paper. The enacted is what do teachers actually teach. And the assessed is what are we assessing on kids learning. The number one issue that I see when I go into systems is that those curricula are often totally misaligned because the people who buy curriculum and the people who lead teacher professional learning and the people who buy the tests often don't speak the same language, and so they don't have a shared goal. So it's very important to make sure that those curricula are actually moving toward the same goal when it comes to improving comprehension. The second thing that I'll say is I have a really simple formula for systems change. It's that curriculum plus coaching equals collective impact. I'm a big believer that curriculum is the key to changing systems. And the studies that really convinced me of this are the studies that you've been a part of with PACT. What's really interesting about the PACT study is because Phil, you and Sharon and your colleagues did it with middle school. I was a middle school teacher and I had like five sections of middle school. You guys randomly assigned certain classroom sections to get packed and others not to. And when the kids were taught by packed, they did better. That's a curriculum test because it's the same teacher. And that's been shown to be effective even in a national sample of US schools. That is very powerful evidence that curriculum matters. And the second thing is coaching. Once you get the evidence-based curriculum, you need coaches to help teachers implement that curriculum. There was a review study by Matt Kraft that showed that if coaching focuses on helping teachers get better tomorrow, it's really effective. And the states that have done this, like Mississippi and California, where they've had these policies, curriculum plus coaching has led to collective impact on third grade reading.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's very hard, as a former teacher, to provide good instruction without strong curricula. We just don't have the systems in place for teachers to develop the types of high quality instructional materials that would be needed to advance comprehension, for instance. I think
Yep.
the other thing I might add is, I know there's concerns about over testing and teaching to the curriculum. But when you look at the efforts that have been successful, perhaps in Mississippi or in those early block grants I think you're referring to in California, you do see, a lot of focus on those efforts. They're all focused towards common measures of progress, and the accountability systems are designed to support when folks get off track with high quality materials and coaching and time for collaboration. And so I think you're right, curriculum coaching and making sure that your assessments are aligned to your goals.
Yep.
Yeah. We're just about out of time. I want to ask you one closing question. If you were to fall asleep and for a decade and you were to wake up in 2027, what would you hope that what teachers would know better about reading comprehension a year from now?
I'm going to go back to the reading rope that we talked about. We're all familiar with, word recognition and language comprehension are interwoven to produce skillful reading. Here's what I want everyone to remember. What are ropes for? They're not just for tug of wars between the people who say it's word recognition or language comprehension. Ropes are for climbing big mountains, aren't they? And what kids really struggle to climb are those very, very big mountains that we call complex academic texts. And you need a really strong rope and a really good coach to help you stay on track. So, what I'm going to leave you with is a question, which is always ask when it comes to reading comprehension, what are ropes for? And how can we as teachers and coaches help kids navigate the really big mountains?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Jimmy, for your contributions, both to reading comprehension, but your insights today about knowledge building, about the best ways to support vocabulary, um, and the system level supports that are needed. I think if I were to, look ahead 10 years, I do think the way in which you're thinking about these semantic maps for vocabulary will be really common practice. The same way we talk about tier two vocabulary now, which I think is important. I think, we're going to be thinking about, vocabulary networks. So I appreciate that contribution. And to everyone who is here, I too wish that we had more than a half hour. I see someone mentioning that in the chat. I appreciate you all coming. For those attending live, you'll receive an email with the video recording, some key takeaways, and resources from this session. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues. And I encourage you to join next week. It'll be our last episode in our series. We're going to wrap up with an amazing public school reading coach named Margaret Goldberg, who will help us reflect on the series and think about how these insights from reading research can help translate into everyday classroom practice. Until then, thank you, Jimmy. Thanks to all the educators out there for the work you're doing.